Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and crisis decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire here at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training and make research applied and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Paul Taylor. Paul Taylor is an assistant professor in the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he studies decision-making, human factors, and system safety in the context of police interactions with the public. Paul has over 10 years of practical law enforcement experience, including time as a department training manager, patrol sergeant, and use of force instructor. Paul is the founder of the Association of Force Investigators and has delivered law enforcement-related instruction for academy, field training, and advanced in-service audiences, as well as graduate and undergraduate level courses. Paul is actively engaged in law enforcement research and training across the United States and internationally. Dr. Paul Taylor, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, sir.
Oh, Chris, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm excited to talk to you today, Paul. We're going to be specifically talking about a very important paper that you published in Police Quarterly back in 2020, and it's called Engineering Resilience into Split-Second Shoot No-Shoot Decisions, the Effect of Muzzle Position. Now, Paul, I'm just going to read the abstract to set the context here for our audience to help them understand what it is we're going to be talking about here. So your abstract reads, the purpose of this study was to explore the feasibility of engineering resilience into split-second decision environment that police officers face during potentially deadly force encounters. Using a randomized control experiment that incorporated police firearms training simulator and 313 active law enforcement officers, this study examined the effect of muzzle position, that is, where an officer points their weapon, on both officer response time to legitimate threats and the likelihood of misdiagnosis shooting errors when no threat was present. The results demonstrate that officers can significantly improve no-shoot decision-making without sacrificing a significant amount of time by taking a lower muzzle position when they are dealing with ambiguously armed persons, that is, a person whose hands are not visible. So, Paul, first of all, tell us, why did you do this study? Like, what was it? What caused you to want to undertake exploring this issue?
Well, that's a layered question, and it's going to be a multi-layered answer. First of all, I had done research on dispatch priming, and so I had looked at the effects of priming on officer shoot no shoot decision making, and found that pre-event information can have a significant impact on that split-second decision making process. But one of the things I feel very strongly about, and the research tradition looking at human error, some of those researchers kind of instilled this in me, is the importance of not just identifying errors, right? So not just pointing out where we make mistakes, but looking for solutions for those mistakes. And so I started thinking about dispatch priming and where can we have an impact on pre-event information that may not be correct. And so I've had a lot of people reach out to me and say, well, what could our dispatchers do differently? Where can we fix the information flow? And the fact of the matter is we can't. We're never going to fix the information flow, right? There's always going to be the possibility of getting bad information, and some of that could come from the person that's giving the information to the dispatcher. Some of that could come in the effect of having to reduce this body of information down to something that's consumable for the law enforcement officer on the street. But somewhere along the way, just like the game telephone, we're going to get bad information. And this is true for law enforcement in general. A lot of our training really focuses on police perfection. The idea that if officers just position themselves right, if we just have the right tactics, if we just employ the right tool, we can solve these problems. And the fact of the matter is, given the complex dynamic circumstances and environments in which officers work, that's never going to be the case. Officers are going to have poor information at times. They're going to find themselves out of position at times. They're going to find themselves misdiagnosing what's happening in front of them, both to their detriment or to the detriment of the person that they're dealing with. And so how do we start to engineer tactics into this environment so that without sacrificing officer safety, we can improve decision making? And that's really the balancing act there. So that was the initial motivation for this. Also, when I was in law enforcement, there was kind of this constant debate about where law enforcement should be holding their muzzle when they're conducting a search or dealing with an individual that may or may not be armed, hands behind the back, hands in their pockets. We're not sure. Where should we be holding the muzzle? And there's kind of this debate is, well, how long is it going to take for an officer to respond? And do we improve decision-making? Does opening up that visual workspace and not having something right in front of our face have an impact? And so there was that aspect of it. And I was interested in that. And then finally, there's this idea of how do we start to kind of deal with this, what some researchers have called the split-second syndrome, the decision-making environment in which officers are presented with a split-second decision and they have to weigh in one way or another. And can we influence that at all? Right. So those are the kind of the questions that I went into this with, and the reason that I designed the study.
Okay, and this is certainly not an insignificant problem in law enforcement. I mean, really what we're looking at here is you're talking about mistake of fact shootings where you have a situation evolving extremely rapidly in front of an officer where an individual is presenting, maybe their kinematics or their body movement is such that it gives the officer the perception that they're presenting a weapon. And like you said, you can't change that information flow. The subject is going to do those actions. But it's not an insignificant problem. Like in your paper, you talk about the frequency of what's called, and you call them, Paul, false positives. So maybe help us, because that's research language. So help us when we talk about mistake of fact shootings. How does false positives and false negatives tie into that?
Yeah, that really goes back to the research that was conducted by two gentlemen, Scharf and Bender. And they did some research in which they kind of started identifying police shooting outcomes. And they kind of looked at it in two ways. You could have a false negative shooting in which, let's start with the false positive. False positive shooting would look at well, I believe somebody is armed. I take action as if somebody is armed when in fact they're not. On the other side of the equation, and equally important, is that an officer can falsely assume that somebody is safe, they're innocuous, that they're not armed. They can take action with that in mind when in fact they are armed, and it can result in a bad outcome for the officer or for the public. And so it's a balancing act, and Scharf and Bender kind of categorized it in these two categories. I think the categories break down even further than that. I think that there's certainly more possible error outcomes that could occur in shooting decision making, but that's where false positive and false negative come from. And really it comes down to, and I like to use medical terminology because there's a lot of research on the medical side of things, looking at how doctors, for instance, diagnose whether or not somebody has a disease, and the same types of things that create the possibility for a misdiagnosis in the emergency room create the possibility for a misdiagnosis, either a false positive or a false negative misdiagnosis on the street for officers. And that really comes down to an officer's prior experience and the information that they bring with them into a call. So what's interesting in this research is all of the officers, and primarily I'm talking about now in my dispatch priming study, all of the officers said that the reason they made the decision that they made, either to shoot or not to shoot, was because of the action coming from the waistband. Well, it's not true. They're not making the decision based on the action from the waistband. And we can take this out to the real world. People pull things out of their waistband, out of their pockets, out of the center console, from under their seat all the time, and officers don't shoot them. When they do shoot them, it's when they either, based on their experience or their interpretation of behavior, or the pre-event information they bring with them, they're interpreting that behavior through that light. And so it's really important to understand that information that they carry with them into that call, and that kind of that lens that they're interpreting that behavior through, is critically important and can lead towards a false positive or a false negative misdiagnosis of what's occurring.
Okay, so one word we don't like to use a lot in law enforcement is the word bias, but I think what I'm hearing you say is if we use that word correctly here is and because we are all of our decisions, and I think we would all be shocked to realize how many of our decisions on a daily basis are actually driven by bias, based on our history, our worldview, our upbringing, the experiences of the moment. And so for an officer then, Paul, if I hear what you're saying, is when they go into a situation, it's never just the simple movement of what is the subject doing that may be a triggering event, but they are already loaded with a whole bunch of bias based on the totality of the circumstances that have led the officer to that point in time. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and it's not just bias, and bias really is it's a subconscious or implicit decision shortcut, right? And we could say heuristics are the same thing, but processing information subconsciously is really a sign of expertise, right? And so we're kind of come down hard on biases and talk about biases, but really that's us forming our expertise. And the more automaticity we develop into our decision making, the more expertise we have. And so if you think about it in the sports realm, right? So we start to develop shortcuts in our decision making right away. So when my son started playing basketball, right? And he's sitting there dribbling the ball, all of his focus of attention is on dribbling the ball. He's sitting there and he's dribbling the ball. And it's really easy just to run up and swat the ball away. Get that out of my house, right? And it's really, really easy to do. Well, once he starts to develop automaticity in that process, he's now able to lift his head up and start to focus on other things. Well, and really, when we say somebody is good at a sport, they've developed shortcuts, they've developed biases, they've developed heuristic decision-making processes that allow them to what to look at, what to pay attention to, and when. And they very rarely have to pay attention to those kind of mundane skill sets that they develop in the context of that environment. Well, police officers are no different. They develop skill sets that allow them to pay attention to what they believe is important in their environment. The thing is, officers are almost never engaged in a shooting. They're almost never engaged in a high-level use of force event. And so those decision processes are almost always around the mundane processes that they engage in every day. A traffic stop, dealing with somebody who's elevated in an emotional state, an intoxicated person, de-escalating a domestic. And the positions and the decision-making processes around those almost never have to do with a use of force event. And so you'll find yourself in a bad position. When we're looking at a use of force event and an officer comes into that use of force event believing that this is what's going to occur, and they see behavior that reflects that, somebody rapidly producing an object from their waistband, whether they're doing that innocuously or they're doing that to bait an officer's response, the officer is interpreting it through that light, and they're starting to see it through that light. And so, bias is kind of a bad word, but bias and heuristics are actually indicative of expertise. And so to understand that decision-making process and to understand how we can train within that decision-making process, we need to understand the implicit shortcuts that officers engage in.
Okay. And again, like you said in your paper, this is not an insignificant issue. You quote some LAPD statistics. It said 14%, at least in their study, of officer-involved shootings involve mistake of fact events where officers believe, based on all of these things that you've been discussing, that at that moment of movement that an individual is presenting a weapon, and they respond and later find out that it was a cell phone or a wallet or nothing. And to be clear, we're not speaking about the technical appropriateness from a legal perspective of that shooting. We're talking about human factors and training, and can we help officers make maybe better decisions? And one thing, Paul, I wonder if you can comment on, you didn't mention, but how does environmental factors impair or further degrade an officer's ability? Because really, when we talk about object recognition, when an individual is rapidly moving something through the officer's visual field, and then we add low light, where that further impairs object recognition, do you think that in a lot of these situations that those are contributing factors to mistake of fact shootings as well?
Absolutely. I think low light. I think strobing light can play an effect, and we've seen that. We've seen that in a few cases. I think that officer having their weapon up in their visual field means that they're actually interpreting less of the body movement, and they're just kind of looking at upper body movements, and they're interpreting it through that lens, can have an impact. And this is in multiple directions. It's not just in threat recognition, it's also in the identification of threat production as well. And so officers can miss those things in both, going in both directions. So environmental factors play a role, certainly. The other side to this, and there's an interesting study that was conducted by Klinger and Brunson looking at I'm sorry, just it was Klinger and some others, but they were looking at work environment, and they found an inverted U with officer involved shootings, and that the most violent parts of our neighborhoods that officers work in oftentimes are not the place where shootings occur. It's kind of in this mid-range area. It's not the lowest level. It's kind of in the mid-range level where most officer involved shootings occur. And part of that is because we develop tactics and behaviors that start to account for violence in our neighborhoods, and so do the people that we're dealing with. So if we're dealing with individuals who are involved in gun violence on a regular basis and they encounter the police, they start to develop tactics around that reduce the likelihood of getting into a shooting with the police, and the police do the same thing. And so environment plays multiple roles, both in our interpretation of what's happening, our development of skills and experience around what's happening. But I think what you're talking about is more the physical environment, and that certainly plays a role. The other side to this is that when we're looking at very rapid presentation, the officer is not really accounting for the object until much later in that process. When we're looking at the first 25 100ths of a second, that's not a decision process around objects. We're just interpreting movement. When we start to extend out to half a second, now we're starting to make decisions based on the cues and what's there. And so what we see is, even with adding fractions of a second onto that decision process where we see dramatically improved decision making.
Okay, and I think that's at the heart of what you were looking at in this study, because just to be clear, there's a lot of these situational factors, the totality of circumstances, that officers can't do anything about. They can't do anything about the information that they've been given by dispatch, the accuracy or validity of it, or whether it's got errors in it. They can't do anything about the lighting conditions. They often can't do anything about the subject behaviors. The subjects will often behave and act in the way that they can. And so engineering resilience then is looking at trying to find ways, tactical engineering components that the officer can do to try to enhance decision-making in these situations.
Absolutely. And really the idea behind resilience engineering is engineering towards human fallibility. So engineering towards the fact that we're going to make mistakes, we're going to find ourselves in bad positions, and how do we improve outcomes in spite of that? And so, little ways we can do that. This study looked at muzzle position, and again, in a simulated environment, we can dramatically improve decision making, but also starting to understand our tools and the limitations of the tools that we use. Oftentimes, the companies that sell the tools that we use promote them, as they should, as effective tools. But when we start to look at them, we should be looking at them as law enforcement trainers and law enforcement officers with the idea that, hey, this tool is probably going to fail, right? And so rather than looking at this and saying, this is going to be a successful deployment, we should be looking at it and saying, yes, it's going to change behavior, just not the way I expect it to. And do we have the resilience in that in our response to respond if that person doesn't respond the way we expect them to? That extends all the way to de-escalation tactics, right? So oftentimes we develop de-escalation tactics as a process, as something that we engage in. Well, what happens when that process fails? And really, and I know you've looked at this and others have looked, we should be looking at it as an outcome. And we should be looking at creative problem solving to get to that outcome. Yes, I may have this tool, this de-escalation verbal process that I engage in, but if that process fails, do I have the resilience in my response to renegotiate the situation and end it as best as possible for the person I'm dealing with and as safe as possible for me? And one of the things that I see with things like de-escalation is there's a significant goal conflict. When you're presented with a subject with a gun to their head versus a gun to their side, officers in a simulated environment treat those situations differently. In one case, they'll stand back and order the person to drop the gun. In another case, a significant number of officers will lower the muzzle of their gun and start approaching them and say, "My name is Paul. How can I help you, sir?" And they'll start getting closer and closer and closer, engaging in those de-escalation tactics, but they start decreasing the resilience of the response. And then what happens if this gun comes down? Either the person gets shot or they end up shooting an officer because the person has closed the distance. And so we've collapsed the resilience. And what we should be looking for in these circumstances, whether it's deploying less lethal, whether it's dealing with an ambiguously armed person, is how do I improve my decision-making process? In my study, I found that lowering the muzzle, even to a low ready position, dramatically improves that decision-making process. We reduce the likelihood for error in this study 100%, right? So we come from 60% down to 30%, which is the baseline that I found for the control group, unprimed group in my priming study, dramatically reduced that. And the cost is 11/100ths of a second. And to put that into context, as you know, Chris, 11/100ths of a second is less than half of a trigger pull if you're pulling the trigger as fast as you can. It is time, and we need to understand that it is time, but it's a very small amount of time to dramatically improve decision making. In a follow-up study, looking at tasers and holding a taser out at distance, when officers were holding it up, they missed the production of a knife many times from the waistband when they had it up in their visual workspace. Whereas if they lowered it at a cost of 11/100ths of a second to an additional response time, they dramatically improve their decision-making process. And so with this, what we see is small things without dramatically increasing the risk to the officer can improve decision-making and threat perception for the officer involved.
Okay, great. So you've kind of primed us a little bit with some of the amazing results of this study. So Paul, why don't you tell us about the study? How did you do it? What was your methodology, and how did you undertake it?
Absolutely. So basically, we took the same dispatch priming audio that we used in our dispatch priming study, and essentially it was a dispatch audio that told officers that they were responding to a call of somebody who said their neighbors were away on vacation, and somebody was walking around their neighbor's house looking in through the windows, and they gave a description of the person, and that was, for the dispatch priming, that was all that the control group got. Two other groups, one group got an additional update that said the person appeared to be holding a gun. And then a third group got that initial dispatch and an update that said the person appeared to be talking on a cell phone. And so those were the three groups in the dispatch priming study. And what we found in the priming study is that when there was information that the person had a gun, the error rate for shooting a person who suddenly produced a cell phone in a simulated environment went up over 100%. So it dramatically increased. So we took that same audio and we primed all of the officers involved in the engineering resilience study. And so all of them got the initial dispatch and the update that said the person was holding a gun. So all 313 officers got that. The thing that we varied, and this was randomly assigned, was where the officer's starting position was. So either they started aiming directly at the screen, they started at a high ready position, which we defined as at the sternum, and they could either be in close or out, whatever they trained, but that was the position that they needed to hold, or low ready position, which we defined as the navel. And again, they could hold it in at the navel, or they could hold it out, but it just had to be in the navel position. And we asked them not to raise their firearm unless they made the decision to shoot. So that was the only instructions that we gave them. And then they were presented with an individual who, it was this same individual, either produced a cell phone from his pocket after a short period of time or produced a weapon and pointed it at the officers. And with the cell phone, we were looking at how often that person was shot from each position, how often the trigger was pulled. And when the weapon was produced, we were looking at response time. So how long it took the officers to actually fire in response to the weapon being produced. And what we found for those that in the cell phone scenario, 64% shot the person who produced a cell phone from an aimed position. From a high ready position, 56 or 57%, when we rounded up, shot the person with the cell phone. That there was no statistical difference between the two. So high ready and aiming was the same. But when we got to the low ready position, only 30% of the officers shot the person with the cell phone. So we had a dramatic drop in the number of people who shot the person. And so then we were interested in, okay, so that's great. We improved decision making, and that's great from the subject standpoint. But what about when the weapon comes out? How long does it take officers to respond? And so from an aimed position, it took officers on average 0.51 seconds to respond. From a high ready position, it was 0.55 seconds to respond. So only 0.04 second difference. And then from a low ready position, it took 0.62 seconds for them to respond. A difference between the low ready and the aiming position of 11/100ths of a second. There was no difference statistically between the high ready and the aiming position. I think this is important on a couple levels. So some prior research looking at kind of response times has added all the steps, right? So you have the decision-making process, and then the movement time, and then the trigger pull time. Well, in fact, that movement time gets really eaten up by that decision time. And so the movement time really is negligible. It takes more time for us to make a decision about what's coming out of the pocket than it does for us to move. And we start that movement long before we've actually made the decision. And so it gets eaten up by the two. And so important from an expert standpoint, we don't want to just add those times together. That movement time gets eaten up in decision time. But again, very little difference between an aimed position and a low ready position. There are a couple caveats that are important. The first caveat is that we did not use a functional firearm. We were simply using a SIRT pistol with a trigger pull that was set to the Glock standard, factory standard. So it's important to note that with recoil and things like that, that is going to, in ballistics, that's going to change first shot accuracy. And that's an important thing that needs to be researched further if we're going to start talking and training officers to keep a lower muzzle position. One of the things we did see in the study was some slight oversteering from a low ready position, and that first shot with a SIRT training pistol going kind of above the shoulder area as officers kind of came up on their target. And so that may be an issue. It may be a trainable issue, but it's something that needs to be explored further. And we didn't look at subsequent rounds. I didn't see a point in doing that because, again, we were using a SIRT training pistol, and that just didn't make sense because there was no recoil management.
Okay, right on. So a couple of things I just want to clarify. When they were holding, so they had one of those three positions, either basically an aim position, or which would be a on target threat ready position, a high ready, and a low ready. Paul, was their trigger finger, was it in the standard along the frame of the weapon in all three of those conditions?
Yeah, I didn't instruct them on how to do that, but they were all trained law enforcement officers, and from what I saw, all of them kept the trigger off. I did see a little bit of creep for a couple of people, as we would expect with a dynamic kind of encounter happening in front of them, and their focus of attention is on that. That trigger finger, despite our belief that it's our safety, is truly not. And so I did observe some creep on some officers, but all of the officers started with their finger along the frame.
Okay, and I just think that's important just to clarify, because obviously trainers, when we start talking about action reaction time, everything gets parsed down to milliseconds. The question will be, well, if I have my finger inside the trigger guard versus along the frame, is that, besides being a recipe for disaster, as we know, is, am I faster if I do that? The kinematics of the individual that you had. Now, you filmed an individual. Is that what it was? Drawing a handgun versus drawing a cell phone. So they were responding to a video. Is that correct?
They were. It was a simulator. and we had an individual, they engaged in the exact same action prior to that, same background, matching the description from the dispatch, and they actually listened to dispatch audio, so it wasn't, they were listening to an audio prior to this happening. And then the individual, after a short period of time, either produced a cell phone and pointed it at them, or produced a firearm and pointed it at them. Both were black, but the hand movement was indicative of somebody either filming or somebody pointing their firearm. Sorry, I'm below the camera.
Yeah, great. And that's what I wanted to get confirmation on, is that you didn't have a different kinematic or biomechanical presentation. The individual who was presenting the cell phone was doing it with the same movement pattern that would be recognized by the officer as the individual drawing the handgun, correct?
The movement was the same. The presentation was approximately the same time. It was down to fractions of a second as far as the time frame. There was, again, the slight adjustment. So when you're pointing the gun was pointed this way. When the cell phone was out, it fully extended. It was extended as if they were kind of to film. So if I have a cell phone in my hand, it kind of came up like this.
Okay, right. But that was at the very end of the presentation. As far as the movement from the waistband, everything would have been consistent up to that point in time.
Yep. And we were looking at around, it was, I believe, I don't have it in front of you guys, 42, 43 100ths of a second in presentation time to kind of come up and actually point it. It was the same for both. So the decision time, so when we start looking at the decision time on this, so it extends beyond that presentation.
Okay, and what was the lighting like, Paul? Were you looking at anything to do with lighting, or was it just one consistent lighting condition throughout the whole study?
One consistent lighting condition, and we were trying to control that as much as possible. And to go back just quickly to one of your other points that you're making about the finger, I tried to give as little instruction as possible because I didn't want to influence the officer's positioning too much. I wanted them to take as natural a position as they could, whether that be high ready or low ready positioning. And so not a lot of instruction for them on that, except for where we wanted them to hold, and that we wanted them to wait until they made the decision to shoot or not to shoot before extending their arms.
Okay, so then when the individual presented the object, the officers, if they made the decision to shoot, they're holding one of the three positions, either the aim position, high ready or low ready, and then they are responding to the movement pattern of the individual. And so talk to us then, you kind of introduced it a little bit about the false positives, and did you have any false negatives? Did you have any officers who didn't recognize the gun when the gun was presented?
No, all of the officers fired. And I think part of that had to do with the decision window that we gave them. We gave them a full 4-second decision window from the time. And so it would be I would have been very surprised if an officer didn't fire. We did have some long wait times. I mean, if you look at the high ready and the low ready, the max time range we had for that was 1.03 for the high ready and 1.17 for the low ready. It's a lot of time when you're thinking about making a decision. And so, you know, if you were to really kind of look at the data with a fine-tooth comb and you kind of maybe made a time delay for that, we may have had some people experiencing kind of on the far end of that. That was probably more pronounced in the dispatch priming study, where we primed them with the cell phone information and then a weapon was produced. Unfortunately, we weren't able to measure time in that study with the same degree of accuracy, and so don't feel really comfortable presenting that. But just objectively or subjectively looking at their responses, they were extended response times when they had information that the person was talking on a cell phone, and a weapon was produced. And so it does impact officers in both directions. It does change the way that we're interpreting the data that we're seeing, and we're interpreting it through the lens of what we bring with us into that encounter.
Okay. And so in the result, then you found that the officers, if they maintained a low ready position with their weapon, they were far more accurate in being able to judge. And I think you used the term check the swing. And I love that, because that analogy, what you're talking about there is, even though you probably witnessed a beginning of a movement from a low ready when that movement started, but between here and extending and pressing the trigger, they had the ability to extract enough information from what was happening to check the swing. In other words, to not pull the trigger. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, and I think that's there's multiple points to that, Chris, that are really important. And you and I have both looked at a lot of cases, and I know you've looked at more cases than I have. And one of the things that I've seen or I've observed is that, we train kind of all this fancy movement for close contact, or we train a smooth draw and that really that's not what we see in these encounters. And you're absolutely right. From the low ready position, everybody started to move upward. That movement was going on as that decision process is engaged. And we start throwing that response forward long before we've actually cognitively made the decision to pull, before it's even possible for us to have made the decision to pull the trigger or not. That movement has already begun. So they're able to check their swing when they have that little bit of more time, and that visual workspace, right? They're actually working with more information. When I have my hands up here, I'm just looking at the upper body and that movement, and now I'm interpreting that upper body movement through the lens of the information that I bring with me. When I open up that visual workspace, I'm interpreting more. I'm gathering more information as I'm moving, and that movement, I'm still gathering information, and provides just enough time to stop. From a training aspect, I think it's really important for us to understand, and I don't see this, officers have no attentional resources for anything other than what's happening in front of them. And so when we're training officers to engage in logical conversation, or we're training them to engage in some kind of fancy movement, or even to differentiate between tools as they're engaged in an encounter, they don't have attentional resources for that. Their attentional resources are taken up with what's going on in front of them. And so when we're designing tactics, when we're designing tools around that, we should be designing tools and tactics and behaviors that account for the fact that officers have no attentional resources for anything else. When we open up that visual workspace, or we give them more time, that we improve that decision-making process almost always. When you've got time to assess, when you've got time to soak in the actual environment a little bit more, you're going to be making decisions based on that rather than what you bring with you into the call. And even if that's fractions of a second, opening up that visual workspace, giving yourself some distance, giving yourself some cover so that that pressure isn't necessarily directly on you in that moment, you're going to improve decision making across the board. And that's what we should really be looking at as we design our tactics. Anytime you compress that, whether that's through tactics or whether that's through just a misdiagnosis, and you find yourself, you're going to degrade that decision making process. And we get into what you and I know as satisficing decision making rather than kind of more optimal decision making.
Right. Paul, you said something earlier that I'd like to go back to, because I wonder if this is a very critical point and I don't want it to get lost. As you said that the officers who were bringing up from the low ready, is that their initial shot often would go high and over the shoulder. And I think I want to be careful that that's not misinterpreted as in, oh, well, you see, then we shouldn't be in the low ready position, because I think the problem is that there's a dearth of training that is actually being done with our firearms from that position. And so maybe the point is, look, if engineering resilience means better decision making with a low muzzle position, and we're losing 11/100ths of a second, but our decision making is going to be far more optimal. Maybe the takeaway from that is then the training should reflect the criterion environment. In other words, we should be doing a ton of training from whether that's position Sewell or that low ready, and making that decision and punching that out from there, so that we can move quickly and get that good first accurate shot if we make the decision to shoot. What's your reaction to that?
I think that's spot on. I think when you're developing a quarterback, when you're developing any skill set, you want these fundamental skills to be automatic. I don't want to be thinking about those things at all. But if I've never trained those things, and nobody's ever really been training from a low ready position to make that type of decision making, right? Typically, we're starting up here, or we're starting from a holster and we're drawing and punching out, but we're really not starting from that low ready to make that decision process. And if we want to improve that, and if we want to improve that 11/100ths of a second, those are the skill sets that we would train. And I think that's what we need to do to really look at the efficacy of doing this in a real world environment. And we have the capacity to do this. We can put people through simunition training and really look at how decision making changes, improves, or doesn't. And those are the things that we should be testing. Again, this is a simulated environment. Officers aren't having to account for anything other than the subject in front of them. That's it. We tried to reduce the variables as much as possible down to that. And so once we insert this into a more complex environment, does it still hold up? Do we still get improved decision making without reducing the officer's ability to respond when an actual threat occurs? And so that's what I would be looking at as a trainer. How do we start to insert this into the more complex training environment? And still, you should be evaluating outcomes. You should always be evaluating outcomes as you're doing this. What I call micro experiments. We should be conducting on a regular basis as we're going through this, and we have the ideal laboratories to do that as we run our scenario-based training.
Right. So when I look at high-level athletics, I read a couple of reports recently where they looked at both batters and soccer keepers. Everywhere outside of North America, they use the correct term, football. But we'll call it soccer because most people get confused when we use football. But what they look at with those is, it was fascinating research because you look at, so you have a rapidly unfolding kinematic process that's happening. You have milliseconds to read what's occurring and make a correct decision. And for batters, for example, what they found is that when they trained, they improved batters' ballistic ability, that is, their positioning with the bat, the speed with which they can operate that bat, then it extends the time that they're able to use visual, to stay on visual processes to extract a little bit more information. And the same thing with soccer keepers, they train the ballistic muscles that are necessary for rapid horizontal ground reaction forces to move laterally. And when they can increase those skills, then they're able to wait longer to extract more information. And in both of those cases, they find much improved decision-making, accurate decision-making. And so I think we're really talking about a very similar process here, is that, like, if a low ready position is optimal for best decision-making and engineering resilience into these rapid decision-making, so we can reduce mistake of fact shootings, then certainly it's critical that as trainers, we go, okay, we need to really start amplifying the amount of training that we give officers, that ballistic movement with the weapon from a low ready position. And like you said, but it's got to be embodied within a full, use of cover, lighting, ecological realism to it. And so it starts with basic range training, but don't you think that the drills and scenarios that we put our officers in also has to reflect this expectation?
Absolutely. And really interesting finding from the Netherlands. So the Netherlands did a study that replicated the dispatch priming study, and they could not get their officers to shoot the person with a cell phone. For the life of them. But what they noticed is their officers were moving. They started moving first and then started drawing during the move. Right. So they were taking massive steps first, and then they were engaging, right, with the subject. Well, so I started talking to them about that, and the only way they could get that to happen, so they started closing the space down for the officers, and they said, you can't move, and they put walls up, and then they started seeing the effect. The priming effect was there in the United States. And so I started asking them about their initial training. And so how do they start training? They don't start with the firearm in their hand. They start with movement. And so you think about how we do training. We do fundamental training, whack, 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 and then we say, okay, move. And what is that movement? It's like a step to the side or a step to the other side. But the primary response is shooting. Well, that's detrimental for officer safety. It's detrimental for decision making as well. We know that based on Force Science's traffic stop study. We know that based on, you know, real world empirical evidence that officers in the United States will draw to a threat even when it's detrimental to their well-being, and they're taking rounds as they're doing that. Well, why not insert movement first? Why not get cadets up there and have somebody draw a simunition and start shooting at them and say, what are you going to do? And then layer in firearms training. If our first objective should be to move, and from a defensive handgun standpoint, that's almost always the case, right? We should be moving because it's going to take us time to get to our firearm, whether we're transitioning from another tool or I'm trying to draw, that's going to take time. And so engineering that into the initial response as the primary response, followed up by drawing and then, you know, engaging the subject, we're going to get different outcomes. We're going to get better decision making, and we're going to get safer officers that are responding to that. And I don't think we've really thought those processes through in our firearms training. We've kind of inserted movement as a secondary process. The same goes for things like situational awareness, right, on the range, where we engage and then we say, well, look both ways. Well, you and I both know that looking both ways isn't going to change my focus of attention. I'm still going to be focused up here, and I'm not going to see anything. But how do we get like a quarterback to be aware that a quarterback could be sacked? We get a quarterback to be aware that they're going to be sacked, not by having them look both ways before they throw. That would be ridiculous. Yeah. We have them become aware of that by sacking them over and over again. And they start to become aware of the pattern of play and how that unfolds. And they become aware of the fact, I have to be aware of people, and I may have to move and focus my attention in different areas. And so that's how we need to start designing training. We need to design training around the behaviors that we want to see, not just turning of heads, but actual understanding of what happens. And if movement is the thing that we want to see first, then we should be training movement first and then layering in the firearms and looking at other ways. So muzzle position is great. We can get fractions of a second better decision making. Movement is another way we can start looking at these things and starting to layer that in as well.
Right. And maybe even before getting there is we look at the decision making that put you in that place in the first instance, and we go, to use Van Horn's terminology, let's go left a bang and look at what series of decisions, because like as you well said in your paper, there's no such thing as a split second decision. There's a whole bunch of decisions that were made that put you tactically in that position. Now, there are certain situations where things just evolve so quickly and unpredictably. Yes, we get that. But the majority of cases, officers have made a series of decisions while responding upon arrival, upon approach, that they have put themselves in a certain situation. So maybe part of that is the whole, should we maybe also be focusing on enhancing risk assessment, decision-making, and tactical excellence so that we avoid these brittle, non-resilient types of encounters?
Yeah, I think so. And this comes back to, you know, how many times do we see like a beanbag deployment, for instance, when a subject is contained and settled, but that beanbag deployment then drives the subject, and the subject starts charging, right? And so we end up shooting the person. So thinking about when we introduce less lethal, thinking about how we position ourselves, you know, and starting to layer these things together. Listen, de-escalation doesn't occur in a vacuum. And oftentimes it's trained as if it occurs in a vacuum, as if this is the tool that we use. Well, when it's trained in this siloed kind of way, then officers think in a siloed way. They think, well, now it's a de-escalation circumstance, rather than thinking, okay, first we need to make the scene safe. And making the scene safe means containment. It means cover. It means engaging in the de-escalation process from a position of cover, rather than the idea, and starting to think through things more holistically, right? Because the tendency, and look, we can look at any one of these events and say, well, if an officer had gone left instead of right, this never would have happened. You can always do that in hindsight. It's always available to us. And there's always, you know, you could say, well, if the officer just hadn't shown up to work today, he never would have gotten into a shooting, right? Or if the officer just had been a little slower to respond, and you can always say that in hindsight. But the goal should be, okay, so this is an officer's practice. If this was this officer's practice, it's likely other officers' practices as well. And why are we developing that practice? And oftentimes it's around accomplishing a goal other than being involved in a use of force event. So when we say, why does an officer run up to a car at the end of a pursuit? Why would they ever do that? Well, if you look at the three most common outcomes, running up to the car makes a lot of sense. They're either going to barricade themselves in the car, they're either going to exit the car and we're going to make an arrest, or they're going to exit the car and get into a foot pursuit. Very rarely has an officer ever in the course of their career ever encountered someone driving towards them or starting to. And so uncovering why we make the decisions that we make and why it actually makes sense to that officer in the moment is going to be what allows us to start to design more resilient tactics overall. Why did they close the distance on a subject who's presenting as suicidal with a gun? Why are they trying to deploy a taser from 5 feet away when a subject has a bat in their hand? Starting to understand what processes are leading to this. It's oftentimes larger than just that individual's decision making. It has to do with the way we've trained this tool, the way we've trained this tactic, and that officer's experience over the course of a 10-year career that's informed that decision-making process. They've developed expertise. It's just around things other than a gunfight or a high-level use of force.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Paul, you've given us a lot to think about here. There's some amazing recommendations from this paper. And is there any additional ones that, as we come to a close and bring this interview to a conclusion, is there anything else that you wished I would have asked you or that you want to get across to our audience about this study, the implications of it? And we'd also like to hear what you've got on your bench, if you're willing to share what you're working on.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the larger concept and really the idea behind this study is that we should be engineering towards failure. The idea that officers are going to misdiagnose circumstances. There's going to be misinformation that comes out to the officer. They're going to be interpreting it through that lens. They're going to find themselves too close to subjects. They're going to, they're not going to have the attentional resources that we do as trainers when we design our tactics and things like that. And so we need to be looking at how do we design tactics around human fallibility and the fact that officers aren't going to get it right every single time. And really that's what the automobile industry did. They don't design around perfect drivers. They design with the expectation that drivers will get it wrong. And we really should be doing the same thing with police training. Instead of looking at and trying to get perfect officers, instead of telling the officer, listen, if you are having problems at home, don't bring it to work with you. Well, the fact of the matter is human beings are going to bring things to work with them. If I've had a fight with my spouse or I have financial issues, I can't help but think about those things. And so designing tactics around a human being and allowing human beings to be human beings is going to allow us to have safer tactics, both for the officers involved and the people that they're dealing with. And so that would be the primary takeaway that I would recommend. So a couple projects we're working on really looking at how we review post-event kind of circumstances and situations, looking at the interview process, looking at how organizations learn from these processes. And so got a couple studies going that are looking specifically at that, and a large scale project looking at the interview process after the fact.
Fantastic. Paul, if anybody wants to reach out to you and contact you in relation to this study or in any of your other work that you're doing, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
paul.taylor@ucdenver.edu is my work email address at the university, or you could do paul.taylor@forceinvestigators.com. That one is not subject to FOIA if you have a case that you'd like me to take a look at.
Perfect. So we've been discussing engineering resilience into split-second shoot-no-shoot decisions, the effect of muzzle position, published by Dr. Paul Taylor in Police Quarterly in 2021. This paper is going to be appended to the show notes of the study. So what I'd encourage you to do is, before you listen to this interview with Dr. Taylor, is download it, read it so you can wrap your head around what was being researched, what the implications are, then listen to the study. And I'd like you to think about the takeaways as trainers that you can actually take the implications from this study and what are the enhancements, the improvements, the changes that's going to be needed in your training to make your officers better and to make the public safer. Dr. Taylor, I want to thank you for making the time today to come onto the Trainer's Bullpen. It was great to have this discussion with you.
Oh, Chris, it's always an honor. And I'd like to take a minute to thank your audience for the work that they do. Being a law enforcement trainer in this day and age is not an easy job. And if there are ways that I can support you, if there are things that you're finding, please don't hesitate to reach out. Let's have that conversation. And Chris, thank you for carrying that conversation forward. Appreciate the work that you're doing, sir.
Absolutely. Until next time, my friend.